This paper's guiding premise can be stated without too much fuss, and that is that the vast and variegated literary output of Marcus Terentius Varro, lionized already in his own lifetime and for centuries after his death as the most learned of the Romans, is stamped by slavery, especially in those writings concerned with the retrieval and refurbishment of cultural practices fading into senescence or oblivion. Varro's antiquarianism wraps itself around the rhythms of Roman imperialism and the machinery of mass enslavement. On one level, this is to be expected of a cultural moment that is characterized by the rapid transformation of Roman literary culture through slavery and servile work. The contours of this transformation are recoverable from works such as Suetonius's De Grammaticis et Rhetoribus, and recent publications have sought to track both named and anonymous protagonists in this revolution and across the multiple centuries of mass enslavement's redefinition of Roman intellectual life. But even in this universe, Varro, a slaveholder with many opinions on the art of slaveholding, is a standout. Typically voicing regret about the vicissitudes of time and transmission that consign the overwhelming bulk of Varro's writings to oblivion, studies on Varro tend to focus on the identification of the source material for his works, the political and philosophical leanings detectable in what survives of it, or the conditions of their reception and fragmentation. To do adequate justice to the scope of Varro's achievements, several contextualizing approaches are possible. One could follow the lead of Elizabeth Rawson and more recently Claudia Moatti and Caterina Folk, whose intellectual histories have evoked in rich hues the kinetic exchanges among the late Republic's elite class. Or one might opt instead to concentrate more narrowly on the brightest stars in the firmament. Cicero has commanded the most attention, but Varro seems to be enjoying a moment nowadays himself, and interest in the intellectual exploits of Julius Caesar is rapidly surging. His subordinate Sallust is reaping the rewards of reappraisal, and even relatively minor characters in the dramas of late Republican world-making, such as Nigidius Figulus or the more obscure Lucius Salphaeus, are newly basking in the glow of reanimation. Or, beginning with the excellent writings of some of these aforementioned virtuosi, one might sniff out evidence for philosophy in the streets, to follow the lead of Jim Zetzel, and other signs of an intensifying commitment to innovative knowledge practices that radiated well beyond the circuits of the senatorial or equestrian elite. For present purposes, I'll be primarily interested in the question of the cognitive resources that Varro will have had at his disposal to shape his projects. In a Moses Finleyan mode, I want to plumb the unfreedoms that made his exercise of intellectual freedom possible. This exercise requires several preliminary moves, not all of which will be executed to full satisfaction in our time together today. On Varro's freedom to intellectualize and the political and social circumstances that facilitated and constrained it, it will be enough for now to sample Claudia Moatti's evocation of the late Republican scene. It is not really true to say that the Romans were never as free as they were during the civil wars, she writes. But in that breach that was opened up between the mid-2nd century and the beginnings of the empire, Roman thought demonstrated remarkable creativity and dynamism. Undeniably, the period was one of violence, conflict, irrational predictions, and anxiety, in which the memory of Roman traditions was lost. It was a time of very real cultural crisis, but it was also a time that began to explore the powers of the mind, unquote. Although historians of earlier periods of Roman history might take exception to Moatti's claim that only in the late Republic did Romans begin, quote, to explore the powers of the mind, end quote, I am sympathetic to the idea that there's something worth parsing about the relationship between the orgiastic violence of empire and the destabilization of the res publica that it eventually triggered, and the rise of new practices of knowledge production during this period. In other publications, I floated the possibility of reading Rome's imperial expansion as an entry in the annals of epistemicide. The flip side of that knowledge destruction, though, was knowledge creation, and both Roman elites and Greeks writing about Romans regularly credited Roman culture with a kind of adaptive plasticity. Crucial to this plasticity was a hard pivot to systematization, especially pronounced in the intellectual apparatus that emerges around Roman public religion in the late Republic, but apparent in other domains as well. Varro makes a fetish out of this systematization, as best we can judge from the fragments of his most influential intervention in Roman religion, the Antiquitates Rerum Divinarum, preserved mainly by one of his most exacting readers and a world-class systematizer in his own right, Augustine of Hippo. This systematization, as theorized in the writings of Schroep-Hupke most recently and others, was not an inevitable outcome of Rome's collision with the literate scientific cultures of the Mediterranean. Mediated by the arrival of Hellenistic philosophy at Rome, the honing of skills and formalized disputation and disagreement among elites and non-elites in the late Republic, of which Varro himself offers tantalizing snapshots in the fragments of his Menippean satires, for example, contributes to this systematization, but is not its primary driver. That said, the over-the-top commitment to systematization in Varro, arguably nowhere better showcased than in the De Re Rustica's classification of no fewer than 99 types of soil, is no accident. While taxonomic fission of this sort undoubtedly precedes Varro, it becomes an exceptionally potent conceptual instrument in his hands. I'm going to hold in the next few minutes that the Roman imperial expansion's Mediterranean-wide sweep of mass enslavement, from which Varro himself materially benefited, calibrates his species of systematization in a very specific way. Early modern and modern historians of science have identified multiple points of contact and cross-fertilization between the institution of chattel slavery and forms of knowledge production and systematization in fields ranging from epidemiology to management theory. The more circumscribed hope for our time together today is to examine how slavery inflects one proto or quasi-disciplinarized mode of research, antiquarianism, a word I use advisedly, as it is practiced by Varro. Slavery is everywhere in Varro's corpus, and not only where one might most expect it. The peculiar institution's prominence in the De Re Rustica has been much remarked, and with good reason. Whether we take the RR to be primarily in dialogue with immediate antecedents, such as Cato the Elder's De Agricultura and the Punic treatise of the Carthaginian Mago, or as enmeshed in a discursive fabric that extends from Xenophon's Oeconomicus and the pseudo-Aristotelian Oeconomica to the on-property management of Varro's contemporary Philodemus, as well as a number of successor texts, Columella's agronomical treatise, Bryson's management of the estate, and so on. The Varro that emerges from close reading is an enslaver thoroughly conversant with slavery's centrality to elite identity and to elite modes of social and economic production. Joseph Howley at Columbia University has appropriately taken to examining these and kindred texts under the rubrics of despotics. But true to its pervasiveness in Roman society at large, slavery threads its way through Varro's many other writings as well, such as in his historiographical attempts in the De Vita Populi Romani, for example, to identify a time before the advent of domestic slavery. Even, or we might say, especially in the domains of philology and lexicography, the institution of slavery and the figure of the enslaved become necessary and indispensable mediums for abstract thinking. The proof of this comes in some arresting passages of the De Lingua Latina, where matter-of-fact references to slavery betray its profound insinuation into the very process of thinking about language. Thus, for example, in Book's 8 extensive discussion of inflectional morphology, we read in a passage that I've quoted on the slide, there are two types of inflections, a voluntary one and a natural one. The voluntary type is the product of which an individual has arrived by inflection as his will has carried him. So, when three people have bought one slave each at Ephesus, sometimes one inflects the name from the man who sold him, Artemidorus, and calls him Artemas. Another inflects it from the region because he bought him there, Ion from Ionia. Another, because he bought him at Ephesus, calls him Ephesius. In this way, everyone names him after some other thing as seems appropriate. By contrast, I call natural inflection the one which does not arise from the will of individuals, but from general consensus. Thus, when the names have been assigned, everyone inflects their cases alike and says in the same way in the genitive Artemidori and Ionius and Ephesi, and so in other cases. A book later, and involved in slightly digressive treatment of grammatical similarity, opens up to this attempt at clarification. Quote, thus, often we say that apples of identical appearance are not similar if they have a different taste. So also we say that some horses of the same appearance are not similar if they give birth to different offspring. And likewise, in buying human beings, if one is better by nationality, we buy him for more. In all these matters, we do not only take similarities from appearance, but also from elsewhere, as among horses and donkeys, what sort of offspring they beget, and as among fruits, what sort of juice they have. Thus, if someone follows the same in the similarity of words, he is not to be criticized, end quote. The progression of argument, and notably the associative pairing of the breeding of horses with the traffic in human beings, is significant on multiple counts. For one, it offers indirect testimony for a perceived homology between animal reproductive difference and human national or ethnic difference, a striking datum for students of slavery's mutually constitutive interplay with racialization and animalization in the Roman Mediterranean. But I cite this passage only to underscore how slavery's ubiquity patterns and organizes Varro's thought. Emily Greenwood, my colleague at Princeton, has shown for Aristotle's Politics what philological analysis can illuminate about an institution that veiled itself through, among other things, grammar. For Varro, we might make the point, borrowing a concept and phrase from Hortense Spillers, that slavery was his grammar book. It's also possible that Varro's intermittently shambolic style, with its sentences sometimes out of joint, holds another clue to the presence of the enslaved. As Wolfgang de Mello has lately observed, quote, where Varro produces long sentences, there are sometimes anacoluta, and these may be explained in various ways. To me, they are the result of hasty writing combined with dictating the text to a slave, end quote. The tendency to read haste and slip-ups into a specific form of technological mediation, in this case the enslaved taking dictation, is not limited to readers and critics of Varro. Readers of the Caesarean Commentary and of Pliny the Elder's Natural History have speculated along similar lines. Whether this type of claim problematically and mistakenly reinstates the figure of the enslaved as forever the imperfect because deficient medium of transcription is a question I'll set aside for now. As noted earlier, enslaved persons were fixtures in the literary industry of the Roman Mediterranean. But to return to the coupling of slavery and grammar in the De Lingua Latina, let me tee up the provocation that this is no incidental or traditional feature of Varronian philology, but rather a central device for the world-making program that animates much of Varro's writing in other precincts of intellectual activity. It is also one vital element of what makes Varro's project, in its late Republican context, revolutionary. The revolutionary flavor of Varronian thinking is sharpest in what might seem on a first take as most avowedly conservative exploits, the Antiquitates Rerum Divinarum, 16 books of a 41-book tour of human and divine antiquities, completed by 47 BC and outfitted with a dedication to Caesar as Pontifex Maximus. As Christopher Smith has reminded us, quote, Varro was no ivory tower academic, end quote, and the circumstances of his personal involvement in the crises of the late Republic, not least his Pompeian allegiances, bear on the motivations and directions of his work. In several cases, the ARD takes an active interest in communities and cultic practices that collided directly with Rome's imperial expansion. So when we read in one of the many fragments preserved by Augustine that the god of the Jews was Jupiter, this is fragment 16, or in another fragment that among the religious experts of the Jews, the god went by the name of Yao, the history of Pompey's campaigns in the Near East looms in the background. But it is when Varro turns to the painstaking identification in ARD books 14 and following of the gods responsible for the oversight of discrete human and non-human biological processes, the dekeratine, that the gravitational force of Roman mass enslavement as an organizing principle for his own thought becomes most apparent. Differentiation and taxonomy are integral to Varro's work in this stretch of the ARD. Indeed, the penchant for an almost maniacal hair-splitting of divine entities and functions is what would earn Varro lampooning from Augustine, our main source, together with Tertullian and less frequently Servius, for these fragments. Varro begins with human conception, crediting as its tutelary deity Janus, who, quote, makes an opening for the receiving of seed, and I've quoted several of the fragments that I'll be discussing on this slide. The divinity Concebius takes charge of the act of sexual procreation, while Liber oversees the deliverance or freeing of men and women from their seed. This is fragment 93. Mena and Fluvionia control the menstrual flow, while Alemona nourishes the implanted fetus, fragments 94 96, to which Vitumnus and Sentinus impart respectively life and sense perception, fragment 97, not quoted on the slide. Still, other divinities oversee birth according to the month and specific stages of delivery, fragments 98 to 106. And the very first acts that follow birth likewise receive their own tutelary deities, from the newborn's first exclamation to their rocking in cribs and even their feeding, fragments 107 to 114. Corresponding to this differentiation of divinities in connection with embryology and natal science is, unsurprisingly, a similar scheme developed and applied to non-human birth and growth that's preserved more or less in full, again, largely thanks to Augustine's cantankerousness, for plants. Proserpina is entrusted with the care of germinating crops. Next comes volutina, for when nodes and buds appear on stalks. Patellana takes over when follicles open. Hostilina, when the crop is uniformly eared. It is florist turn when the crop is in full bloom. And lacturnus when the crop becomes juicy, and so on. These are fragments 167 to 177. For Augustine, Varro's step-by-step specification of caretaker divinities was not only ripe for mockery, but also demanded some explanation. It's important for us not to assimilate Augustine's derision and the process overlook or sideline the cultural logics of Varro's buzzing world of functional gods, the indigitamento or the Sondergötter. As Mikol Perfigli has demonstrated, what Varro's reader receives in this section of the ARD is nothing more and nothing less than a, quote, taxonomy of reality. And here I'm quoting Lindsay Giedriger Murphy, whom I saw earlier had joined us today. Nonetheless, it's productive to think with Augustine's construal of Varro as a means of gaining a handle on Varro's penchant for taxonomy and its sociocultural underpinnings. Among the weightier questions engaged in Augustine's take-up of a system of religious thought whose orientating principles were shrouded in obscurity and all too liable for polemical distortion by late antiquity, was how best to explain this Varronian science. That there was a substantive science to Varro's work, I hope to show momentarily. In Augustine's opinion, the best inroad into this system's explication was analogy, and his choice of a specific one for elucidating Varro's select gods is very revealing. And now I'll quote a passage from the City of God that appears on this slide. We observe that in these tiny duties, which are distributed in tiny fragments to a plurality of gods, these select deities operate on a footing of equality, like a senate in conjunction with the plebs. And we find that some of the gods who have not been considered at all worthy of selection are in charge of more important and dignified functions than those performed by gods entitled select. This analogy is to Augustine's credit, being the historian with an agenda of Republican Rome that he is for stretches of the City of God. In figuring the relationships of these minor gods to each other and to the major gods of the Roman pantheon as akin to that of Senate and plebs, he participates in a tradition of calquing the theological on the political with very distinguished precedents. One example that immediately comes to mind is the Council of God topos that is repeatedly reworked across multiple genres in classical and late antiquity, with varying degrees of acknowledgement and occasionally parody of senatorial deliberative procedures. Against this backdrop, Augustine's analogy makes perfect sense. But another, even more powerfully explanatory analogy stares at him right in the face, yet goes unremarked. And in fact, Augustine's failure to reach in the direction of this analogy is symptomatic of the strategic occlusion that marks Varro's work and his interpretation of it. The single best analogy for probing the prolific abundance of specialized gods in Varronian theology, I suggest, is not politics but the Roman home, and more concretely, the aristocratic enslaver's household with its bewildering occupational hyperspecialization. It is regularly argued that the taxonomic drive of late Republican thought responds in part to the diversity of Rome's empire and to the perceived need to make that diversity legible. But I am proposing a more specific stimulant for the urge to classify as it receives expression in the cladistic ambitions of Varronian theology, the occupational hyperspecialization and differentiation that take off in the course of Rome's transformation into a slave society. While first detectable in late Republican evidence, and especially in Varro, J.J. Albert discusses, for example, the hierarchical pyramid of servile personnel in De Re Rustica. This hyperspecialization crystallizes in the literary and epigraphic testimonies for slavery in the early empire. The most celebrated instances of occupational differentiation on steroids all come from the Familia Caesaris, and especially the household of Augustus's wife, Livia. I presented on this slide portions of the appendix from Susan Treggiari's PBSR article, Jobs in the Household of Livia. Attested roles range from stewards, dispensatores, and financial record keepers, arcari, tabulari, to copyists and clerks, librari, and managers of the bedroom, cubiculari, dressers and keepers of the wardrobe, ornatrices, with one person even deputized to oversee purple clothes, apurpuris. At Livia's disposal was a cohort of provisioners and craftspersons, from catering officers, obsotanatores, to a wool weigher for spinners, alani pendus, and a shoemaker, calciator. A precise account of Roman slavery's catalytic role in Republican and imperial labor specialization and stratification would be a task for another paper. For present purposes, it will suffice simply to note that one meticulous effort to tabulate occupational titles for imperial Rome arrived at a final, but given the limitations of the evidence, necessarily incomplete tally of 192. But why exactly should we see the occupational hyperspecialization of Rome's slave society as imprinting on Varro's delineation of functional gods? And what about the emergence of that feedback channel rises to the level of revolutionary, as I floated earlier? I'll take up the second question shortly. But with respect to the first, it may be clarifying at this stage to bring into the discussion another Roman writer and philosopher who, in addition to being well-versed in Varro's work, was also an aristocratic slaveholder. Here is Seneca the Younger in a fragment of his treatise De Superstitione, for which Augustine is once again a major source, holding forth critically on the cult services that were offered to the Capitoline deities. But if ever you go up to the Capitol, it will make you feel ashamed just to see the crazy performances put on for the public's benefit, all represented as duties by lighthearted lunacy, honest furor. So Jupiter has a special attendant to announce callers, and another one to tell him the time, one to wash him, and another to oil him, who in fact only mimes the movements with his hands. Juno and Minerva have special women hairdressers who operate some distance away, not just from the statues, but from the temple. They move their fingers in the style of hairdressers, while others again hold up mirrors. Meanwhile, craftsmen of every trade stand around waiting for work on behalf of the immortal gods. While these behaviors may seem tame in comparison with other historically documented modes of interacting with cult statues, such as licking them, something that is attested, in Seneca's eyes, this guanus furor was unjustifiably outlandish. For our purposes, and even making allowance for exaggerating distortion on his part, what matters most is the centrality of slavery to the ministrations of cult that he describes. Every single one of the occupational performances referenced in the passage is documented in the literary and epigraphic sources for servile and freed person occupational specialization at Rome. And while it's correct to stress, as just as Lipsius first did in the 16th century, that this Capitoline Jupiter's retinue is akin to that of a Roman magistrate, the more correct framing to adopt here is of Jupiter as a slave-holding paterfamilias, with Juno and Minerva as materfamilias and filia familias, respectively. But in addition to emphasizing that the best comparison for this structure of service is the Roman slave or household, I want also to subject to scrutiny the theology of service that is bundled into the activities that are typical of what the media theorist Marcus Krajewski has, following Marshall McLuhan, taken to calling servo-mechanisms. In a Roman context, this theology of service was instantiated or made real through the activities of attendants announcing the time to Jupiter and hairdressers tending to Juno and Minerva's tresses, all acting at a physical remove in a repetitive quasi-mechanical praxis which has some distal affinity to the robotic devices of Hero of Alexandria's Spiritualia Pneumatica. If we're willing to look beyond Seneca's calculated derision, a system of belief that is predicated not just on the presumed isomorphy of human social relations and their divine counterparts, but on the constitutive role of slavery in the visualization and representation of that isomorphy, begins to come into view. In order to gauge how far this reading of Seneca can take us on Varro's flights of functionalist detail, I'll say a few more words about Krajewski's notion of the servo mechanism. His critique of the transmission of data and its dependence on and routing through agentive media as exhibiting various states of unfreedom has two relevant insights for my paper today. The first of Krajewski's insights is that techniques of service, and especially those that are cued to the most sharply graded or carefully parceled responsibilities, are always interwoven, quote, in recursive patterns within a hierarchically established operational chain, end quote. The second is that communication processes sustain themselves, quote, on an excess of human agents, which can claim greater significance in their aesthetic arrangements and their optical overpowering logic than mere functional necessity would require. The power of the ruler is duplicated in his footmen, who ostentatiously flaunt their idleness for him in vicarious inoccupation, end quote. It is these two dimensions of a cultural technology of service that, I would suggest, can be located within the taxonomic obsessions of Varronian theology, provided we entertain the possibility that the functional gods of the ARD are at their core servo mechanisms. They exist to discharge a duty in much the same way that the Empress Livia's stewards and copyists existed to discharge theirs. In other words, and inverting the apparent lesson of the Seneca fragment, it's not that the Roman slave economy's imprinting on cult and theology primarily asserts itself in the identification and installation of specially tasked ritual performers, such as the figure of the Camillus who attracts Varro's attention in the De Lingua Latina. It asserts itself instead through the multiplication of duties and competencies among the gods themselves as one reflex of a slaver mentality that strove to analyze the universe of the divine as decodable according to the precepts of occupational differentiation. On its face, such a reading does not resolve difficult questions about the ARD's tone, nor does it tilt matters decisively in favor or against Leah Cronenberg's recent effort in 2017 to develop a Menippean reading of Varro's theological project that is alert to registers of satire and parody. While I think there is something goofy about the doggedness with which the functional offices of the De Curati are laid out, the state of the fragments doesn't justify any strong claims about authorial tone, I feel. Where Cronenberg must be right, though, is in flagging both Varro's own professed rationale for embarking on his work, famously, quote, fear lest the gods perish not by the enemy's assault, but by the negligence of citizens, civium negligentia, and Cicero's shower of praise for the ARD's author as suspicious. In any case, what my reading tries to do is establish what makes Varro's ARD a revolutionary project. For all that the ARD has been branded time and again as an undertaking of recovery and conservation, it was extraordinary and almost fiendishly inventive. As has been repeatedly noted, the text has no obvious literary precedent or predecessor in Greek or Latin. But it also represents, in my view, a spectacular and arguably game-changing eruption of slaveholding into theology. Varro's thinking takes shape in a, quote, revolutionary atmosphere, and here the phrase I'm using is taken from Momigliano's 1984 article. Of that, there's no question. But a revolution is immanent in the ARD as well, not least because of the audacity with which it welds together the slaver worlds of the late Republic to its philosophy of religion. For contemporary students of Christian theology, William James Jennings has unlocked the manifold routes by which, quote, the slave legacy of Western education, especially theological education, is lodged deeply in our educational imagination, end quote. I'm quoting from Jennings's After Whiteness. If one were to go casting about for a charter or exemplar text for theology's imbrication with slavery, the ARD ought surely to appear in the nets before long. The charismatic force of its coupling of slavery and theology for elites being formed in the crucible of despotics ultimately proved irresistible for Augustine, who eventually found himself in quite the bind as he worked to deconstruct its authority. How to debunk a work whose twisting itemizations of assorted divine functions seemed so risible, yet whose scheme for routing theological thinking through the institution and thought worlds of slavery had already sunk its teeth into him. There is much truth to Malcolm Schofield's remark that, quote, Varro was turning living tradition into text, indeed into a database. Internalized ancestral knowledge becomes objectified ancient history, end quote. But if my read of Varronian practice is correct, in a theological context, this objectification sought and ultimately could not be realized without the medium of the most objectified, the enslaved. It was the practice of systematized objectification that cultivated and sustained those habits of mind around which Varro's religious antiquarianism took shape and gained momentum. Taking to heart Wadi's recognition that both Varro's embrace of linguistic ratio and Caesar's ordering of time through calendrical reorganization are feats of coercion, we do well to acknowledge that the late Republican intellectual revolution was at its core a business of force, exerted with equal vigor and violence over abstract entities and flesh and blood people. In redescribing slavery as conceptually generative for Varro's theology, I am moving to the beat of recent research into Roman philosophy's investments in the peculiar institution. My objective has not been to dwell too much on explicit references to slavery in Varro or to inventory the, quote, stock of concepts and beliefs ambient in the slave society of Rome, end quote, that the ARD rated in the preparation of his intellectual arsenal. And I'm quoting Carey Seal from his 2021 book, where he tees up and invigorating study of slavery in Seneca. I am interested instead in examining the deep structural affinity between the taxonomic urges of Varronian theology and the hypertrophied occupational specialization that Roman mass enslavement enabled and fueled. This interlacing of slavery and theology was centuries in the making, presaged by the sport with abstract divinities in Roman comedy, a genre in which Varro was expert, and before that, the rise of cultic personifications as a Mediterranean-wide phenomenon. But one will search in vain for a coherent attempt to assert a causal or symbiotic relationship between the escalation of mass enslavement on the one hand and the cultivation of new habits of religious thinking on the other. The problem is not dissimilar to what one might encounter in studies of Hellenistic science, which tend not to grapple with the conceptual generativity of slavery in their discussions of methods and practices. The silence on the subject in G.E.R. Lloyd's The Revolutions of Wisdom is far from atypical. Whenever enslaved persons do make an appearance in the secondary literature, it's either in connection with the familiar Aristotelian contortions to justify natural slavery, or as individual case studies for the diagnosis of disease, or, less explicitly, as victims of scientific experimentation. But slavery's warming into the core of the classificatory zeal that is customarily held up as a distinguishing feature of Hellenistic science is what needs more centering, I think. With Varro as my guide, I've attempted to do that by relating the systematizing theology of the late Republic, which is in itself a form of Hellenistic science, not only to the expropriation of text through conquest, but to the traffic in human beings. My interpretative slant also helps bring out some of the epistemological consequences of thinking with and against Varro on at least two levels. For one, by historicizing Varronian theology as stamped by mass enslavement, we're not swerving far from Varro's own professed attention to the interaction between knowledge production and cultural change, most readily apparent in his treatment of the Latin language, but also discernible in his biography of the Roman people, the De Vita Populi Romani. But arguably more enhancing in the long run, however, is the development of tools for identifying and neutralizing Varro's practice of what we might call epistemic distortion. The taxonomic overkill of his work isn't without negative effects, both in Varro's own lifetime and in the many generations of the ARD's reception. Despite, or perhaps because of, Augustine's withering criticisms, the treatise's vision of Roman religion did bias centuries of scholarship against the recovery of alternative modes of religious experience that did not hew to Varronian systematicity, or that did not conform to the rationalizing paradigm that was presumed to underpin Roman conceptions of divinity. To name one of the more conspicuous examples of this biasing, it is largely thanks to archaeological evidence that Varro's insistence on aniconic worship as a defining feature of archaic Roman religion can finally be read for what it is, not as a credible historical observation, but as a moralizing proto-anthropology that does some ideological heavy lifting. But Varro's importation of the strange fruit of mass enslavement into Roman theology is epistemically compromising, amounting to what we might even term a tragic epistemology, a phrase I owe to Tony Alimi, not only because it distorts to spectacular effect what is known or knowable about Roman religion. It also blurs the historical dynamics of Rome's selective takeover and reordering of Italic cults, many of which are subordinated through syncretism into the pantheon of the city of Rome, the same orbs that, over the course of Varro's own lifetime and in the following generations, overwrote the histories of the peninsula's conquest that had previously been encoded into its fabric, as a 2019 piece by John Patterson has well brought out. That blurring, that overwriting, was a form of epistemic violence as well. By foregrounding slavery as a cardinal yet unvoiced principle in the ARD's conception and organization, I hope to line up future readings of the treatise and Varro's other works that are similarly committed not merely to the correction of the historical record, but to a kind of epistemic activism that pushes against the enticements of the Varronian project. Many centuries before abolition became to assume credibility and persuasive force, not only as a moral demand, but as a scientific project, slaveholding achieved standing as a master science that pervaded and suffused other sciences, agronomical, lexicographical, theological. For this reason, I conclude by raising my voice in protest against intellectual history that organizes itself around great men simply because they were, quote, in fact, great men, end quote. And here I'm quoting from the justification that's advanced in Katarina Volk's book. Any intellectual history that is insensate to, or only minimally conversant with, the material and structural conditions of mass enslavement is neither fully intellectual nor properly historical, in my view.